What was something you noticed between the groom and bride on their wedding day that made you think they shouldn't be getting married? Story 1. My friend was getting married to his neighbor. I hardly knew her, didn't know he was into her. The wedding was rather sudden. They were both from very religious families. She had gotten pregnant after they had had once in a moment of weakness and drunkenness. Their families pressured them into the marriage. At the wedding, they barely looked at each other. They argued, though with enough taste to do it quietly and away from most guests, over several details, and the bride got very drunk. Had I mentioned yet that she was pregnant? The baby was born with dark hair, though both my friend and his wife were blonde. DNA test confirmed the baby wasn't his, and they divorced less than 6 months after the marriage. Edit to clarify. The baby had dark hair after a little while, was born with little to no hair. I also just looked up the dates, yay for Facebook, and they actually got divorced after about 8 months. Close enough. Story 2. The bride wouldn't stop hugging my husband, who, unbeknownst to us, was her first true love. He thought they were good friends. All her friends knew that she was in love with him and were shocked that he showed up for the wedding. My husband was clueless. She was clinging to him and crying. It was horrible, and we bolted as soon as possible. Story 3. They had split up a couple of years previously because he drank too much and got violent. When they reconnected years later, it was on the understanding that he would never drink again. I found him drinking neat spirits behind a bush at their reception. Story 4. At my best friend's wedding, the groom's dad was dropping some things off at the church. Just to make small talk, I said, "Bob, are you ready for the big day?" He said, "Well, you know what they say, everyone's gotta have a first wife." Story 5. My niece was 27, top-tier lawyer, beautiful woman, marrying a thrice-divorced 42-IO who has somewhat mysterious means of support. He was a very attractive man, seemed aloof, and her parents were gritting their teeth. They didn't like the guy. We flew in the day before the wedding, and after the rehearsal party I had a few minutes alone with my niece. I have always been her favorite aunt. All I did was ask her, "Are you sure you want to marry this man?" The floodgates of emotions erupted. She started bawling. She wasn't sure. She didn't know what to do. She hugged me, sobbing. I calmed her down, got a glass of wine in her, and she told me that about a week ago she had an epiphany. She realized this guy was not right. But now she was afraid to back out with all of the money, travel, planning. Long story short, we had a midnight meeting with her parents, and she called off the wedding. Yes, it was very difficult. The groom's family went ballistic. Thousands had already been spent by the guests and my sister, but all of the people close to her were relieved. Instead of a wedding reception, we had a family reunion with all the food and stuff. Niece married a nice guy a few years later in a civil ceremony, has 3 kids with him. A good marriage. Story 6. The groom flinched every time she moved her arms near him. It was painful to watch. They are still married, and he no longer speaks with any of us. Edit. I got a hold of his brother, and he told me that the family fought to get him out of it. Back in April, they forced him to put in divorce paperwork. They told me to call them at 6 p.m. tonight to talk to him. He's been pretty depressed, and they think this might help. Apparently, everyone was pushed away. I thought it was just me. Edit 2. Just got off the phone with him after a really awesome 3-hour conversation. For his privacy, I'm not going to put many details, but he is fine. He told his sister about what was going on. She got the family involved and did what families do. We did a lot of catching up, and I feel so happy that someone else was able to do what I didn't know how to do. Thank you all for your assistance in this. He has seen this post and is grateful that people care. We made plans to meet up next month. Story 7. My best friend since middle school was getting married. He is really good at piano and singing, so he wrote a song and sang it to his wife at the reception. He was super nervous, but he killed it. Every woman was in tears. It was such a lovely song, except for the bride. Stood right next to the piano with what I interpreted as a forced smile. The attention wasn't on her for 5 minutes. Divorced 2 years later. Story 8. When the best man's speech talked about how much he was in love with the groom, how they had been together since long before she showed up, and if there was any truth, justice, or beauty in the world, it would have been the two of them being married. Story 9. Wedding photographer here. At one wedding, the sexual tension between the groom and best man was greater than between the groom and the bride. Edit. Added, was greater, for the making of a complete sentence. Thank you. You, marvelous comment. Story 10. The groom spent most of the day running around like crazy, making sure everything was perfect, whilst the bride spent a lot of time, and shared knowing glances, with the best man. Story 11. It was raining outside, in Southern California no less, and the groom was in the hallway screaming, yelling at the bride that they would still have the wedding out in the rain. She kept saying over and over, "We can't do this to our guests," and he refused to back down. We were there for several hours while this went on, and all of us awkwardly hung out in the reception area, listening to the echoes of the argument. The wedding was called off that day, and there was a sigh of relief, but unfortunately, they ran off to Vegas and got married the next weekend. Story 12. The groom looked bored throughout the entire wedding. He fought back a yawn during the vows, but everyone saw it. He was with his best man the entire reception and barely sat down with her. A month later, the bride found out he was fucking his ex and actually fucked her 2 days before the wedding. He actually invited her to the wedding and she sat at a table just smiling while she knew what a cheater they both were. Nasty divorce. Story 13. Was a disaster from the start, although the most extravagant wedding I've ever attended. Well over 100K cocktails before the reception, and the groom is smashed. One of the bride's best friends from out of town complimented him on how great his eyebrows looked, and he replies back with, "WWTF are you trying to say about me?" Then he tries to kick her out, even though she was just being polite. After that fiasco, he keeps drinking and it was time for cutting the cake. So normally you just cut the cake and maybe rub a little into each other's faces. Nope, he baseball pitched the cake straight into her face. I'm not exaggerating, everyone went completely silent. The bride runs out of the reception, bawling her eyes out, and her father follows. Her brothers start to get in his face, but it was quickly calmed down. Once she returns, the groom decides it's time to make an apology over the mic. You can guess how much of a disaster this turned out to be. Incoherent nonsense. As the night is ending, the groom is outside with her brothers and dad trying to fight all of them. Yep, the marriage was annulled the very next day. Story 14. I think the first thing I notice is how much of a couple they are. Like, this is our crazy day versus this is my perfect day and whatever. Like when things go wrong and they both honestly laugh, you know it's a strong foundation already. But if things go wrong and one is upset and the other is trying to fix it or worse, ignores her. I give it 2 years. 5, tops. Because people know my alias and I officiate weddings part-time, I don't want to point anyone out recently. So I'll mention my wedding in 1989. We were young, 2018ths. From a long-distance relationship, she was the popular girl from a small town. I was the nerd from the big city. No one wanted to help out, so we planned and financed most of the wedding ourselves. We overheard relatives say, "I'll give it 2 years." We were happily married for 25 years before she passed away in 2014. Our marriage outlived most of those relatives. And the key was we worked together on things. Hell, we ran a large anime convention for part of that time. We were a team and we were partners. Foxhole buddies. Us versus the world. That's what you need to look for at a wedding. Story 15. The parents' speeches. One side was heartfelt, tender acknowledgement of the couple and how they had grown with each other through the years. Edit to add, the couple had been high school sweethearts who married in their late 20s. The other side had what felt like a 10-minute speech on how wonderful their son was, with very little acknowledgement of the bride. Was very one-sided. Struck me as odd. I think they are divorcing now. Story 16. At my cousin's wedding, his wife didn't really look him in the eye while they said their vows. They got divorced a few months later when it came out she was fucking her boss. Story 17. All of her Snapchats and social media posted photos in the final weeks leading up to the wedding were of her running around doing every last errand, staying up until 2 a.m. finishing decorations, making all the final phone calls, and organizing while he watched sports. Then, on the weekend of, she was running around setting up everything while he got shit-faced with his groomsmen in the hotel for the entire day before the wedding. It was a destination wedding, so everyone was there a day early. He was so hungover that he almost missed the wedding. His vows were a single sentence, and hers were uncomfortably intense and long-winded about how she loved him more than life itself, and he has her whole soul now. She had prepared thoughtful surprise after surprise for him during the reception, which again was uncomfortably overkill, while he wouldn't even help her set up his own wedding. Also, the juxtaposition of the speeches. Her friends and family all talked about how great a wife and mother she was, and how special it was to finally see them become an official family. They already had kids. And all of the speeches about him were about how he was such a great party bro, and how he should maybe stop putting so much up his nose now, but will definitely keep drinking as hard as ever. Then the next day, when they had to start cleaning, taking things down, and packing up, again, she was running around doing everything while he was sitting around visiting with his guests and groomsmen and going on about how it was his fucking day. The hotel should do everything for him because he just got married. Even though he didn't hire anyone to help take down everything, he's fucking broke, so he wanted the cheapest package where they just rented the room and needed to set up, take down, and clean it themselves to prevent getting charged more fees they couldn't afford. So like always, she did everything, because now she was officially married to this man-child. Holy, this turned into a long rant. I'm sorry. I guess I just feel really bad for my friend, the bride, and I've had this pent up for a while. Story 18. He announced that they were knocked up, yeah, to everyone without her even in the room. Then watching them, besides the ceremony itself, I don't think they even said a word to each other the entire night. They obviously sat together at dinner, but talked to all the friends around them. Then there was no first dance. Someone actually said, "This first dance, let's party." And then like 3 people poured onto the dance floor. It was a show. Story 19. Not on the wedding day, but just before. Pre-marriage group thing through the church. They had the men split off and the women off in separate round table discussions. One guy asks if it's strange his fiancée sleeps with her parents all the time, even when he is there. Then says she went home every weekend during college. She's currently a senior. 9-hour one-way trip. We all said yes. Story 20. So I'm getting married next Saturday. So far, what I've learned from this thread is that I need to look out for my bride making eyes with and continuously hugging my best man, their family. My own urge to flinch or hide when she's around me or to throw cake at her. Her being impregnated by a colleague and getting overly drunk while preggers. I need to put my most unstony face on when I see her. Be sure that she's not a lesbian, heartbroken, or hopeless. Make sure that I keep the sexual tension between the best man and myself in check, and be sure that she is of age. Wish me luck. Story 21. My wife was a bridesmaid in this wedding. I videoed and was going to edit the footage together for them. After the wedding and much drinking, the wedding party went to the couple's favorite bar for more celebrating with the core group of friends. Few more hours of drinking and the bride was so faced, and the truth started coming out. She started trashing the groom and anyone else that got in her way, my wife included. She ended up calling her ex-husband at 2 a.m. and telling him she had made a huge mistake. I took the phone and told him she was drunk. He understood. Night ended with us shoving them in the limo that was supposed to take them to their hotel and hoping for the best cause we were all sick of it. They are still married from what we know. We are no longer friends with the wife, and I still have their unedited wedding footage on my computer. Story 22. Leading up to the wedding, he didn't call her his fiancée. It was like he avoided the term or something. He also didn't fully change his address to their new place, and only really moved in with her because she insisted. The biggest red flag, though, is how much he complained about her, in subtle ways and overt ones, regarding the same exact sets of issues that, shockingly, didn't resolve upon marriage phrase. Story 23. Heavy involvement with the church strong handed an old pair of friends into getting married. They were fresh out of college and had been together since middle school. The bride was very sad and mellow on the day of the wedding. She was physically there but mentally checked out. Exasperated sighs, forced smiling, and feigned excitement. I understand being a blushing bride doesn't complement everyone's personality. She even paused walking down the aisle with a look of sheer panic, but was guided by her soon-to-be father-in-law. The groom, on the other hand, was serial killer calm. He was ushering people in, calling them coaches and Judd. It was strange. His vows were almost like a comedy sketch, alluding to their colorful differences. At the reception, someone discreetly mentioned to him that the bride was crying, and he scoffed, insisting it was probably because her special day is almost over. It was also rumored he picked up a cater waitress. They never signed a marriage license, split up a year later, and left the church. Bride is now in a lesbian relationship with a wonderful woman and is happy as can be. Last I heard, the groom is auditioning for The Bachelorette. Story 24, outdoor ceremony and reception in a barn-type thing. Bride was blazed during the ceremony. Just had a happy, dopey, complacent look on her face while the minister was talking. Then she came and smoked with her old friends, including me, throughout reception. Groom never did. It was like she was disappearing from him to come smoke. And it wasn't the "I'm gonna casually enjoy myself tonight" type of smoking. It was the "just one more hit, I need this," before heading back over to the main party with the same deadpan, complacent smile. They split 8 months later. Expensive mistake, but the food was good. Story 25. Not me, but at my brother's first wedding, my grandma apparently saw a brief exchange of looks between the bride and her boss. She kept her mouth shut, and sure enough, within the year, they were divorced. Bride was fucking her boss. Story 26. A friend of mine got married to a girl he'd met on a Christian dating site after knowing her for only a month. She also lived 200 miles from him, so they really hadn't gotten to know each other. My friend has been a churchgoer all his life, but he's not a crazy evangelist or anything. It's just a nice, boring Presbyterian church. Anyway, the wedding was at the bride's church. I can't remember the name, but it was a small country church out in the Midwestern cornfields. In the church, we sat as usual, friends of the bride on one side of the aisle, friends of the groom on the other. The ceremony began and all went well for a time, until during the minister's prayer, the bride became overwhelmed with the Holy Spirit. She closed her eyes, raised her hands in the air, and began speaking in tongues. This caused most of the people on the bride's side of the aisle to become similarly taken with the Spirit, and they began standing and waving their arms and speaking in tongues. So you had one side of the church and the bride standing up, waving their arms and shouting, asterisk habala bula amabala babala wabala bubbly asterisk, while the other side was full of slightly uncomfortable Protestants sitting there with frozen smiles, unsure what to do. Yeah, that old Holy Spirit is, great. Sure thing. You go, girl. Looking at each other out of the corners of their eyes, wondering if it was rude not to attempt to participate. Also, my friend, the groom, was similarly unsure of how to respond to his new bride, standing there in her wedding dress, waving her arms and shouting in his face. Remember, he'd only known her for a few weeks, and they'd had only a few dates since it was such a long drive. He waited out the storm politely, and after a few long minutes, things settled down and the ceremony continued. I talked with him at the reception, and he mentioned being surprised at the speaking in tongues from his new wife. I knew she was religious, but I didn't know she was asterisk that asterisk kind if religious. I didn't say anything, but all I could think was, this is why you don't get married to someone you met on the internet after only a asterisk month asterisk. It's been a year and they're still married. Happily, I guess. I see him on Facebook occasionally and they look happy. I don't know if she's got him speaking in tongues now. I wouldn't know how to ask. Story 27. I went to a wedding for my wife's coworker. She took her sweet time getting ready and made everyone wait an hour to walk down the aisle. It was her perfect day for the sake of it being her perfect day. She wasn't in love and just wanted to get married. Everyone there knew it. Even the mother of the bride made comments like, well, it's the Jackie show, implying that it wasn't really about the marriage. My wife and I predicted it would last 6 months. It turns out we were right. She was very upset her husband was cheating on her, but the entire time she was cheating on him. Just a sham and completely pointless event. Story 28. She was 16, he was 24. She had to get her parents to sign so she could get married, if I remember correctly. The marriage lasted a month, I think. Edit. Fixed a word. Story 29. Not at a wedding, but I make wedding cakes for a living. The other day I had a cake tasting with a very nice young couple. They were both very nice and polite during the tasting. When the tasting was over, and we were about to start talking about pricing and contracts, the groom excused himself and asked if the bride and I wouldn't talk about anything while he was away. He came back with his mom. She was a very rude woman, pretty much told me to shut my mouth and write down 5 different prices of various cakes. While me and the mother were talking, I noticed that the groom had a death grip on the bride's arm, and she didn't look happy and she looked to be in pain. I felt so bad for the bride. She was such a sweet girl. Story 30. They were over the top clingy to each other. Not like a normal couple that has a special day, but more look at how much we are in love. Really, totally in love. Absolutely. Can you tell? I had known them for a few years already, and it was definitely off. I later found out that he had laid down rules for the marriage the day before, and she had been thinking of running during the whole ceremony, but was too afraid of him. He became a neo-Nazi shortly afterwards, beat her up, caused a miscarriage, and divorced her after spending all the money they had been given for the wedding. I hope his rot's off. Story 31. At the reception, the groom spent the whole time going around with his mother, and the bride was sitting alone. My friend group went to hang out with her for a while, but we had to leave early to get home. Long drive. And I don't think anyone else paid much attention to her after that. They separated after 2 months. Story 32. A bridesmaid got up and told a funny story about how the bride lived with some other guy during a break from the groom. Their divorce lasted longer than the marriage. Story 33. Everything was stilted. The decor was beautiful, wedding party was dressed to a T, bride and groom both happy cried during the vows. There was a limo service. Reception had an awesome dinner and short speeches, but it all felt like it was scripted that way. Almost like watching a movie wedding rather than a real one. Don't really know how to place exactly what was off, but I think there was just something about the bride and groom, like they were acting. Well, sure enough, after a few kids and 8 years of constant fights, therapy, and even a couple arrests, they're getting a divorce. Turns out he had cheated on her since before the wedding. Had. She didn't know about it at the time, but I think she felt something was off. Story 34. My cousin's soon-to-be husband was more concerned with perfect wedding day photos than her grandmother. Her grandmother was 90 years old, walked only with assistance, and was having trouble getting to the spot where everyone was standing for the wedding photographer. While my cousin, dress and all, is trying to get her grandma over to stand with everyone else, her groom is screaming to just Forget her! Forget her! We won't have perfect lighting if we wait for her. My cousin is a very family-oriented person, and it mortified her, especially because, in her words, he had never yelled at her before. Mortified her worse because they did take pictures without her grandmother, who died a few months later. They're still married somehow, but not exactly happily. He keeps trying to make her cut contact with my side of the family, and even his dad pleaded with my cousin to get a divorce when they found out she was pregnant. Told her that having no father is less damaging than a crazy one. Manim. Story 35. I got two. First, groom abandoned bride at reception to drive off and collect his kids from his ex and take them somewhere. Was gone for hours. Bride, friend of ours, ended up sitting in a circle of old friends getting hammered with us, putting on a brave face. Marriage lasted 3 years. Second marriage for both. Guests were mostly her friends. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, bride moaned frequently about how my life will be over soon. I have 34 days of freedom left, etc. Like Martha Stewart counting down the days until she had to report to prison. Groom seemed adrift and lonely at his own wedding, hopped from table to table during pre-ceremony cocktails, assuring her friends that we all had carte blanche to continue talking to her after they were married, as if she were a lawnmower we were free to borrow. Bride segregated wedding guests, mostly her own friends, into an A tier invited for the ceremony and sit-down dinner, and a B tier invited 3 hours later for dessert and dancing only. Bride took more pleasure in categorizing her friends than in the groom's presence, informing us A-tier guests during dinner that we were the cream of the crop. B-tier guests, including groom's few friends, showed up before dinner was over and stood out in the drizzle hammering on the windows while we finished our salmon. Groom seemed to disappear at that point, and bride ended up drunk on the dance floor, doing the electric slide by herself, sloshing Chardonnay everywhere. Divorced in 2 years. Addendum. Her big post-marital complaint about him was that after she cut him off sexually, forcing him into the guest room, he sought out internet featuring women who looked like her so he could masturbate to someone similar. In her view, this was pathetic and unjust. Story 36. Soon after my cousin's sister and her husband got married, we were taken to visit their new house. When she was showing us around the place, he kept knocking her on the head in a playful way whenever she had an opinion about something. As a 12-year-old, I found this very disturbing and wondered if she married a nice person. Few months down the lane, they had insane fights coupled with physical violence from his side. It's been more than 10 years now. She is still married to him and has 2 kids. I don't know what the scenario is now. Story 37. While celebrating their engagement with everyone, the groom got drunk and started talking all possessive about his bride. Like this is how you keep a woman. When you meet a woman like her, you gotta lock it down fast with a ring, like it's a cage or something. Pretty obvious red flag, but she was determined. They were my neighbors. Woke up to what sounded like him trying to de-escalate the situation with a slap to her face. Sounded like she would respond by throwing every piece of furniture she could lift at him to help her properly enunciate her rebuttal during these insane fights. In terms of intimidation during a fight, it sounded like she won. The marriage lasted 3 months, because apparently every time she left to go somewhere he'd assume she's cheating, so he'd go out and cheat constantly, regardless of whether or not she actually was. So they tried saving the marriage by staying in together in their tiny studio apartment for a month, with nothing but their hate and complete lack of trust between the two of them for company, before throwing in the towel. The marriage counseling wasn't enough to make a dent at that point. Story 38. Yeah, the bride spent most of her day hanging with her family, and the groom spent most of his day with his. There was very little mingling. In fact, the only interaction I had was to shake his hand at the very end of the reception and wish them good luck. He shrugged at me. He cheated on her within 6 months. Marriage was over in less than a year. The bride is a really sweet girl too. She deserved better, and her current husband is a coach potato. She has rotten taste in men, it seems. Story 39 was before the wedding, but I seen the bride complain about how cheap he was for proposing with his grandmother's ring instead of buying her a new one. According to her, she said yes, but he better actually buy her a ring before the ceremony. Story 40. Last summer, my then fiancé and I went to his cousin's wedding. The groom, cousin, was very happy, positively beaming during the ceremony. The bride marched her wedding party up the aisle with a sour look. It was bizarre. After the ceremony, the bride was micromanaging the photos, the welcome drinks, the catering, and when the speeches ended before the food, she stood up and said she wouldn't be a traditional woman, she wanted to do a speech. She didn't have a speech. Whatever she said was not memorable. She ran to the buffet, then drank heavily with her bridesmaids. After food, she and her husband walked around to talk to all the guests. She was determined to get around everyone, whereas he wanted to linger and chat, so she literally dragged him around after a, "Hi, how are you? Nice to see you, bye." As the music started, she was with the bridesmaids watching the empty dance floor. He was at the bar with the groomsmen. He wasn't smiling anymore. They attended our wedding in the summer. She still looks like she's got a bad smell under her nose, and he looks defeated. They aren't even 30. It's very sad. Story 41. Spotting the groom kissing the best man before the reception, and the bride finger-banging one of the bridesmaids behind the reception tent. But both families were very Christian, and they were both so far into the closet they were commuting from Narnia. Story 42. Lifelong friend was getting married. The normal traditional wedding where bride and groom don't see each other on the wedding day leading up to the ceremony. Bride comes back to the house where he's staying and has a total meltdown over something stupid. They are yelling at each other through the bedroom door since he's not allowed to see her. This was one of many meltdowns she had during the time they dated. You always have that joke where the best man tells the groom now's the time to run away, leaving her at the altar. Well, when I said it, I handed him my keys and let him know I wasn't joking. Told him to get the out and I'd cover for him. Of course he married her. Lasted less than a year. Story 43. Wedding of a friend's roommate who was crazy, jealous, and temperamental. The bride's vows were a study in low self-esteem. When we first met, I couldn't believe that he could ever have liked me. I thought no one would ever be attracted to me. She is at least a 5 or 6, not ugly by any means, etc. They got divorced after a couple of years. It was initiated by her, surprisingly enough. Guess she found some self-esteem? Story 44. From the beginning, she wasn't really involved or excited about the wedding plans. She just didn't care. The groom planned most of the wedding, which was at a mountain resort across the country, her home state. It wasn't an easy wedding to get to. His friends and family had a long flight and then drove 3 hours to get there. They were doing pictures before the ceremony and the bride disappeared into the woods. No one could find her for about an hour. People started to panic. The groom was thinking he'd have to call it off. He was planning a speech. Finally, the wife of the best man tracks her down. Bride is crying and we all assumed it was cold feet. The wife of best man said, "Don't marry him if you're not sure. Who cares what people think? It's not fair to him." But the bride shook her off. After all, everyone made such an effort to be there, she didn't want to disappoint people. So they went through with it. Most everyone close to the groom, including the groom, knew they should not have married. But it was like being on a train at full speed and not being able to get off. They pretended to be happy for about 6 months with him, doing most of the pretending. Got divorced. He had the wedding annulled. This mattered to his parents. And then she came out. She's a lesbian. In the end, he met a super cute gal. They got married. She planned it down to the last detail. And now they have a couple of kids. Story 45. I attended the wedding of a friend from grad school and his wife. Every time they hugged each other, it looked really awkward. It was as if he never hugged someone in his life, and she looked as if she barely liked him. Their wedding kiss was also a bit too businesslike. I hate to say it, but I think she married him because she's from China and needed a green card. I think he married her in spite of that because, quite frankly, he's probably a 5 at best, and she's a 10. Story 46. My husband's friend was joking on his first wedding day about things he'd do differently for his second wedding. He filed for divorce 2 years later, citing his wife was messy and overbearing. Story 47. Bride's father got drunk and started talking about Naruto and lovemaking on a mic when the couple were trying to have their first dance. They had to sit back down while he talked about the power of fucking and flailed drunkenly all over their table. Couple fought the rest of the wedding. Story 48. Complete disinterest from the groom about anything to do with the wedding. He wanted zero to do with the planning and would get grouchy if he was even asked for an opinion. Day of, he asked to be told what he needed to do and when, as he planned on spending the rest of the time drinking in the alley with his buddies. He did exactly that, what was required with the least possible enthusiasm, and became more and more obviously drunk. The rest of the wedding was awesome. Food, music, open bar. He was the only turd in an otherwise awesome punch bowl. Maybe too awesome, as I woke up on the couch in the bridal suite and the first thought I had was, why am I wearing pants? The last I remembered, I was still in my bridesmaid dress. Fast forward till 3 days before their 1-year anniversary. She comes home from work and he's moved out. Before the wedding, they'd been together for 7 years and owned a home together. Turns out he'd been cheating for last few years and continued after the wedding. But he doesn't get all the blame. She had very much drank the Kool-Aid of supposed to. Supposed to go to college, supposed to buy a house, supposed to be married by X age, supposed to have kids after a year. It's not coincidence that she was engaged on her 29th birthday and married a week before her 30th. After the divorce, she ended up selling the house, buying one of her own, and is incredibly successful in her field. He's a fat, balding barfly who decided to cash out his retirement and quit his job at 33 to spend a year getting DUIs. Edit. Forgot about another wedding I was at years ago. In both of their vows, they said semi-promise. As in, I semi-promise to love, honor, etc. Story 49. I'm an amateur photographer, but I've shot a few of my friends' weddings for free to save them some bucks when asked. Bride and groom have been rocky on and off for a decade when they get married. I'm at the end of the aisle as they exit snapping photos, and I get to hear the first private words exchanged between the happy couple. Bride. Well, that was a whole lot of money for a whole lot of nothing. Story 50. A co-worker got pregnant and decided to get married to her live-in boyfriend before the baby was born and invited me. I went and watched as her groom eye balled all the chicks entering. And I thought, oh man, they should not be getting married. Later, I found out he was having an affair with 3 of the girls at the wedding behind her back. These girls were supposed to be her friends, too. Man, what a mess. Story 51. When asked the question, she said, I do. He said, well, I guess. Obviously, I wasn't the only one to notice that. The entire audience gasped. Somehow that marriage still lasted for 18 months. Story 52 sister's second marriage. The problem I seen wasn't necessarily the groom, but his entire family. They were control freaks. Everything had to be dad's way. Nothing felt normal about his family. I was the sound DJ for the wedding. Grandma commandeered my audio equipment because the music the bride and groom chose was not music. So we ended up listening to 3 hours of nothing but Elvis. Not that I have a problem with Elvis, but that wasn't the choice of the wedded couple. Fast forward 3 years. Fast. Grandma wanted sole custody of the children, and Dad told groom that it was to be. Sister got a little angry at the notion, and said that they were now independent, and if groom listened to Dad anymore, they would be divorced. Dad was one of those ex-military, I tell you to jump you ask how high, or else. Groom was a daddy's boy, and followed everything he said to a T. Dad bragged how he could get away with severely illegal things because he knew what strings to pull. Death threats were made against sister and my entire family. Divorce was swift and sweet. I seemed to be the only family member that their family forgot about, so I was the one holding all copies of any evidence that if anything happened, I was to give it to the police.